Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Once again, I am very honored to present Professor Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor. That's ngo-monitor.org. And we're going to talk about the foundations of NGO Monitor, where it started, why it started. And it all started 25 years ago. The anniversary is coming up of the Durban conference of 2001. And the very particular definitions and currents that resulted from that. First off, Professor Steinberg, what a pleasure it is to talk with you today. And I know that there's a significant time difference here, so I appreciate your flexibility.
Oh, good to be with you again. Yeah, that's there is a time difference, but we're still in the white zone, as distinguished from being too dark out there.
Okay, well, so, good.
Again.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you, sir. So let's talk a little bit about this NGO forum at Durban, the conference in 2001. This is, I think, prior to people really starting to cast a very skeptical eye about NGOs. Maybe I'm fuzzy on this, but I think that this might have been part of the reason why people eventually started looking at NGOs as a real issue. So talk to us about this conference in 2001. What was this supposed to be about?
It was officially supposed to be a world conference against racism. In fact, the official title, it was a UN conference run by what was called then the Human Rights Commission. It was supposed to be the World Conference on the Elimination of Racism, something else, and Xenophobia. And it was a long title, very, I'd say, very grandiose in typical UN form. It took place over roughly a week. They brought in thousands of what they called delegates, and we'll get into some of that in a minute. In a large part of it was held in a stadium, a football stadium in Durban, South Africa. And it was supposed to, as they advertised it, supposed to come up with a plan for eliminating racism. But it was in South Africa because it was Nelson Mandela had been released. The era of apartheid was over. And that was part of the celebration with I'd say the slogan, well, if we could defeat the apartheid regime in South Africa, get Mandela not only out of jail, but to be the president of a new and thriving South Africa, that was the image that they had in those days, certainly not thriving now, then we can conquer all sorts of forms of discrimination, racism, xenophobia, by bringing all these wonderful people together. And who are the people they brought together? There were three parallel forums, and you're going to stop me after a while because I can go on for an hour and a half on just this stuff.
Oh, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. Hey, I'm an old radio host. We love it when people talk.
Okay, I'll keep talking for a while.
There you go.
It was like I want to be careful about the language. I don't want to make it too humorous but it was really a three-ring circus. There were three parallel forums, frameworks that took place, again, roughly over a period of a week. There was an intergovernmental forum where you had diplomats from close to 100 countries came together. I'll mention a couple words about that. Then they had something called the Youth Forum, which wasn't particularly significant. It was more advertising and saying, okay, this is a future generation that's going to fight for these values. And then the center of it was something called an NGO forum. And you're right, nobody was really paying much attention. Or I would say NGOs had a halo effect in those days, really strong, completely unquestioned. And so the people...
I mean, because I mean, the whole idea of the NGOs was that these were private organizations. They were trying to do good. These, this is, and maybe coming out of an era where they may have been, and this may also be a little bit of rose-colored glasses looking backwards too. They may have been somewhat less politicized in the couple of decades prior to that, but they certainly had become politicized by that point.
But that was not something that was seen or known. In fact, in a lot of ways, the NGO forum was coming out of the closet and declaring, hey, we're political and we're powerful and we're going to impose this agenda. So the whole thing was hijacked. This conference, then the UN does these things sometimes every 5 years, sometimes every 10 years. This was the first such forum against racism. But again, it took place after the end of apartheid, after Mandela in South Africa. And the other ones, there was an attempt to use them for political agendas. and particularly, I will get to that because that's really got what got my attention, particularly to use it as a forum to turn human rights into a weapon against Israel and the West. But before Durban, it wasn't very blatant. At Durban, it just came right out. How did that take place? I think that's the important aspect of this. So I'll say a couple words about the Intergovernmental Forum, and that'll take us to the NGOs. We'll dismiss the governments in a few minutes. That
Okay.
but first of all, like every other UN circus or UN extravaganza, there were a series of preparatory and preliminary conferences that took place in different parts of the world to get everybody going, enthusiastic, get the blood flowing, all of that. Huge amount of money in these things too.
Right.
When we're talking about 8,000 delegates and bringing them all there and housing them and everything else. But also the preliminary conferences were very, very large scale and ambitious. And already about a year before Durban opened sometime towards the end of August, maybe the 30th, 31st, and ran for a week. Well, already in February, they had a preliminary conference or preparatory conference in Tehran. All right. So
Right.
right there, you get the, and just as a side part of it, although deserves a longer conversation, Mary Robinson ran the whole thing. She was the High Commissioner or Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN. This was her show. And she told Jewish organizations, Israeli groups who were concerned about back in 2001, that Tehran, the government, same basic Islamic government we have now, different people, that they would, they said it's a UN conference, we'll give visas to Jews and to Israelis. Well, not, they all got visas about 2 weeks after the conference finished, or the preliminary conference finished in Tehran.
Right.
The whole thing was a farce. But they, at those conferences, and again, Tehran was the main one, there are other ones in different places, including in Geneva, that's where they write the texts of what is supposed to be the resolutions that are adopted unanimously or by vote at these various forums. So they wrote a text for the Intergovernmental Forum. They wrote a text for the NGO Forum, both of which were singling out, focusing on, and attacking Israel, targeting Israel, accusing Israel of the terms that we're now used to. That's why it makes it so important. Already in those preliminary drafts, Israel's an apartheid state, a genocide state, but it was also demands for reparations for slavery against the West. The West would have to pay huge amounts of money for the sins they committed. Nobody's going to look at what other countries know, China and what they did, their conquests, or and current and ongoing police state, closed societies, regimes that control everybody's lives. That wasn't going to be part of it. And of course, minorities in China, minorities in Russia, not even mentioned in those frameworks. This was
And
against the
I
West.
want to I want to stop right there because this is, I think, the key piece, right? Which is, and even apart from the anti-Israel stuff, which has been sort of an ongoing issue for decades at the UN. Mary Robinson, definitely big part of that, but certainly not the only
She
part of
picked up
that.
the package that the Russians and the Kremlin had left when they fell to the Soviets, when they disappeared in 1990.
Exactly. And what's interesting about this is how openly they felt that they could manipulate this. And I think successfully so. I mean, I don't think that they were wrong. I mean, it worked. And that was a huge part of why we're at what we've seen over the 25 years since. And I know you're going to get to that. But what's interesting to me is how shameless this was. Also, the timing of it, because the NGO conference, you said it started at the very end of August. It extended to September 7th, 2001. And then 4 days later,
9/11.
What happens? We
Yep.
have 9/11. Yeah. Which should have completely reoriented the discussion. It did maybe for a hot second, and then it stopped.
They weren't as successful, the manipulating processes throughout this, which was still the same basic characters and within the UN very strongly. They weren't as successful. They did not succeed, I'd say, largely or partly in the United States with the Intergovernmental Forum, where
Interesting.
Israel, the United States said, This is already under the George W. Bush administration, right? We're talking about middle of 2000. This is, yeah, the early 2001, after the inauguration. This was already on their agenda. And they said at the time, some of the people you may remember, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, or I think she was National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of State was Colin Powell. And they said to Mary Robinson and to the UN, we're not going to do this. We're not going to participate in this unless you change the language. And they said, okay, Mary Robinson, the UN said, okay, we're going to change the language. We're not going to do what was adopted in Tehran of condemning slavery and forcing reparations and or demanding reparations. We're going to make this a more, I would say, bland set of resolutions. So the U.S. delegation gets to Durban in August of 2001 and sees nothing's been changed. It's the same resolutions that they were told was going to change. The U.S. and Israel walked out. That was a very unprecedented move to walk out of this massive conference. And the Bush administration was attacked and criticized and condemned by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International.
Right.
Got into the
The
major
usual suspects.
and in the media. Those were quoted like line by line in the media, in the legacy media. That was all there was in those days. There wasn't much social media, but a lot of legacy media. So the
Can I ask you something?
intergovernmental. Yeah, go ahead.
Before we move off of this, I want to talk about the funding that preceded this.
We're not going to move off of this for an hour, but go ahead.
Right, exactly. Yes, I know. But you mentioned the structure, the funding. How much of that came from the U.S.? How much of that came through U.S. aid? Because this is one of the big issues of the last year here in the United States, which is that the Trump administration has basically just cut off U.S. aid. And a lot of this stuff was money that was flowing to NGOs. There's a lot of media hyperbole about, we're starving people, people are dying by the millions. Almost none of this money actually left the country in a direct aid sort of way. Most of it funded NGOs. How much was?
I'm going to disappoint you a little bit on that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the U.S. government was, and maybe still is, the largest single funder of the UN. So, and a lot of this money goes into these frameworks, and the U.S. was then a member of the Human Rights Commission in those days, it was called.
I remember that.
So there was U.S. money there, and significant amount. But the extra money to run this kind of conference came from the Ford Foundation, came from the European Union, came from the Canadian government. I first found out this was all being planned in the I would say the official forum. This is a wonderful thing. I had been speaking to Canadian diplomats and government officials as part of my other hat as an academic, and we were on some committees together. And I was in Ottawa, and I met with the people that I knew, and they said, "Oh, by the way, this is, by the way, in a period where there was still there was some efforts being made to patch together what was then called the Oslo Accords that from 1993, and there were various committees, and there was a whole bunch of stuff going on about disarmament or arms control and security in the regions. The Canadians were very big on that, and they said, "Oh, by the way, this was again a few months before Durban took place." They would say, "By the way, we are co-sponsoring, co-hosting, I guess co-sponsors. We're going to put a lot of money. We're going to bring a lot of these delegates from NGOs and pay for some of the costs of this big conference." And I said to them, "You guys know what you're doing on this?" "Oh yeah, it's going to be wonderful. We're going to end racism." This was a liberal Canadian government that believed, and they, part of their big claim to having a role in the world then and still now is, hey, we're big supporters of the UN. So no questions asked.
Right.
And that has repercussions. So the Ford Foundation, the European Union, they all fought the Ford Foundation is a private foundation, but I'll add some more about that later because that had repercussions for them. They actually did the right thing afterwards, not like the Canadians and the Europeans. Canadians and Europeans took taxpayers' money, a lot of it, and poured it into this black hole. And we're very proud of it at the time. So that was that. Yeah, the money part was out there, and that was they bought influence, as often governments do, through supporting and saying to everybody, "Hey, look what your money is buying. You're buying the end of racism and xenophobia and all those other things that are so terrible, and we're making the world better." So they put this money in, and the Canadian delegation One of the main people there was a professor of law who was also the Attorney General, Erwin Kotler, and he did the right thing. And he said, okay, we're going to stay after the Americans and Israelis leave. We're going to fix the text. And the text in the intergovernmental framework in the forum was largely a pretty bland text. It didn't have all those words like apartheid and genocide and reparations for slavery and all the other stuff. So now we shift the focus to the NGO forum. There, nobody walked out because there was no government there, and they wouldn't let anybody who had different views, again, including the Jewish and Israeli, and also some of the Christians who were there representing their NGOs. They said, you can't go and speak here. You are a Zionist, or you don't have the credentials. They made up rules, and they physically blocked them from participating. It was a real Bolshevik framework. A guy named Reed Brody from Human Rights Watch was one of the main people there who said, we are going to stop you from speaking. And that tells you what these are. That was Human Rights Watch,
Right.
And they had this reputation of being a liberal organization. To a large degree, they do still now. It hasn't really, the reality hasn't penetrated, although there have been some slow changes there. So the NGO forum turned into be the real disaster area, the one that's set up for the last 25 years, everything we're seeing now, including all of the what they call demonstrations or protests. It's really mob violence, attacks on synagogues, attacks on Jews. They're using the language and the claims that were made at an NGO forum back at Durban 25 years ago. That's what put the whole issue of NGOs on my agenda. I had been sort of aware of this. I'd seen parts of this before in some of the other things that I was doing as a side issue. But then I saw this this was the big bang. This is okay. Yeah,
Yep.
We can do this. We have the power to do this. Nobody's going to stop us. We have a large amount of money. We're going to change the world. We're going to call it human rights, but what we're really doing is we're going to determine the agenda for what's called the international community through the UN, through the NGO industry. They never called it industry, but I think that's the appropriate term.
No, I think it's
Media
an appropriate term.
allies.
Yeah.
You got your media allies. You got academics planted in different universities who are part of that process. That was their big coming out party, and to a very large degree, they succeeded, at least in that dimension of the Durban strategy.
Well, I think so. And I think you see the results of this. And you mentioned the fact that countries get involved because they want to, they spend money because they want to influence, it's certainly that's how countries operate. Can be either benign or malign, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. But I think it's very clear that the Iranians definitely wanted to be a part of this. It's the reason why they hosted a regional conference, so they could frame this, because this was part of their overall strategy to destroy the state of Israel, which was to make them an international pariah on the basis of human rights, which is, it's an absurd proposition for anybody that understands anything about the Iranian regime for the last 47 years. It's has one of the worst human rights track records in the world, maybe China and
Still
North Korea.
executing people every day.
Yeah.
And nobody
Yeah.
cares. You never see Human Rights Watch or Amnesty say, "Oh, this is a bad thing." They're executing protesters or executing women who won't wear their hair covered, things like that. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. And so they were able to succeed at this. I mean, it's one of the things I think we're discovering over the last few months is that I think Donald Trump even said this, is that the Iranians have never won a war, but they've never lost a peace. And he's frustrated. I understand why he's saying it. And I think that there's still room to change that in the current conflict. But he's not wrong. These guys have been playing a long game for decades. And it didn't start, by the way, at the Durban 2001 conference, but it's certainly a big part of how they've been able to manipulate international opinion and isolate, or at least attempt to isolate, Israel. And we're seeing the fruits of this after October 7th here in the streets. We're seeing it in the elections this year in the United States.
It is a hijacking or takeover process, and they do it piece by piece.
I call it preempting, because I mean, it's hijacking suggests it was sudden. This isn't sudden. This is a stealth operation that preempts and basically poaches structures that you know, this sort of, we talk about long march through institutions. It's similar, but not the same thing. But I mean, this is a patient strategy. They are working their way through, and they are getting successes because
Let's
of that.
talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's another thing that's largely overlooked. The main actors in this Durban 25 years ago were the UN and the NGOs. And of course, with their, what Marxists would call useful idiots, or Leninists would call useful idiots of governments, who were really enthusiastic and thought this was a big deal. But it shows you how easily these institutions are subject to hijacking, to takeover, to long-term strategies. The UN is very porous. I think even the Trump administration, which has cut back a lot of the money, but they still feel that they have to position themselves. So they gave, I think, $3.8 billion recently to another part of the UN. They closed down, or they ended funding for the refugee and the works agency, UNRWA, that was formed in 1948. These are all still considered to be refugees, all these Palestinians, after all these years. But then they gave 3.8 million. This was a couple of weeks ago, the State Department, to this Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the UN. Now, you know, I'll make this overstated. I won't say this in court, but I'll say it on your show. They are clueless. They don't know where that money is going to go, and they don't care. Maybe they'll care later when they find out it goes to all the same things they don't want to do. They tried to defund earlier. But the UN is considered to be something that, okay, you buy prestige, you put your money in there, and you don't pay attention to where it goes as other people are out there. So it's so thoroughly penetrated. And I mentioned, and I came back to Mary Robinson, because she was part of this whole process, and she went in eyes wide open. I think it ruined her career in the end. It was worse than she expected, and there was more pushback, and she was basically not able to become UN Secretary General. But the institution, the people around her in the UN, which are basically the same institutions and type of people you see now, only with even more power, they're easily controlled. So you got 190 countries. The biggest bloc is 55. And by the way, 55 countries or 56 countries are called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, or Cooperation. They changed their name. They played a big role in fashioning, hijacking, controlling Durban back 25 years ago as well, because they're the biggest bloc. The UN used to have something called the non-aligned movement.
I was just about to say, I was just about to bring up the non-aligned movement. Yeah, I remember that from when I was a young man, right? The non-aligned movement was very big in the papers. Everybody loved the non-aligned movement.
Yeah, because they were not aligned in theory, between Soviet Union and the US through the Cold War. So their whole purpose faded, and countries like India, there were big leaders. India was a big leader of the non-aligned movement, became an ally of the US. So, but who took over their place? It was the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. They got 56 votes, I think, automatically. And if you go to countries that are dependent on your oil, on your money, that are controlled by you, you're up to 70, 80 votes. And then you got the Soviet Union, you got Russia and China and all the other dictatorships voting with you. So they're a huge bloc, somewhat formal, but OIC is formal. The others are less formal. They control most of the UN agencies. They decide who are the leaders, who are voted in, picked to run the Human Rights Council, to run OCHA, as I just mentioned, to run all of the Secretary General, all of that. So it's easily manipulated, because it's like a democracy in the, I would say, in the most ridiculous manner. Every country gets one vote. You're a dictatorship, you get one vote. You're a democracy, you get one vote. So you're outvoted every time. That's part of it.
Right.
And NGOs, the other part is how easily NGOs are hijacked, penetrated, taken over. So I started paying attention to the NGOs in a very, I would say, detailed way, obsessive way, some people will say. I became my work for the next 25 years. And now I got 20 people working with me in the organization. People are paying more attention to the NGOs. I'm doing your show twice, so that shows that you're paying attention. People recognize what they didn't recognize 25 years ago. But the process by which these NGOs were taken over, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, you go through this a long list. I'll just tell you, to realize how big an industry this is. and how much power they have. And it's part of it got to do with the fact they're called charitable nonprofits. They get special tax write-offs and all that other stuff.
Right.
So Doctors
Well,
Without
I mean,
Borders.
we're seeing just as a tangent here. We're seeing some of that now with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, this is
Yeah, oh,
not
yeah.
necessarily one that plays internationally. It's primarily domestic American NGO, but it's been thoroughly corrupted to the point where this is just yesterday. The Department of Justice announced the indictment and arrest of its former CFO for funding the very hate group or hate groups that supposedly the SPLC was supposed to fight, as a way of basically boosting business for the SPLC and using manipulating that uh, in a political way against people that they just simply disagreed with. I mean, this is the SPLC is, I think, in a microcosm, exactly how all of these NGOs end up
Yes.
getting corrupted because there's really no accountability for these NGOs, especially the international NGOs.
I'd say you just summarized 25 years of my work in one perfect sentence. Let's go back. There's no accountability, right? The funding is often very secretive, nebulous. I can give you some examples later on of how all this stuff works. But yeah, SPLC, you ask yourself, how many years has been going on? This guy was a CEO for how many years? How did he get in? And who was supposed to be monitoring him? And the system, it's not just the United States, although that's where a lot of the money comes from, but it's true in all these European countries and the British Charity Commission, which is the equivalent of the IRS division that runs the 501c3s and 501c4s, the nonprofits, the NGOs. They opened an investigation into a Muslim charity and the way in which they were involved in transferring funding from probably foreign governments that's going to be investigated, large amounts, to these spontaneous demonstrations, which were not demonstrations or were not spontaneous, that started after October 7th, all across British territory, all across the UK. So they're doing their job that they should have been doing 3 years, 10 years, 20 years ago. They're they opened up. Well, I shouldn't give them that much credit yet. They've opened an investigation because it was a big scandal. Research that NGO Monitor did. That a lot of stuff is available if you do enough digging on open sources. Southern Poverty Law Center in the U.S. is a similar type of scandal that broke into the public eye. I wouldn't say all NGOs are like this, but a whole lot of them are. And the suspicion is that because it's so easily manipulated, it's so easy to get somebody in the boards of these organizations. Board members don't do their jobs. And most of them are volunteers, or they get a small compensation. They get the prestige, but they're not monitoring what goes on. And all these scandals are allowed to take place. And it's maybe now we're starting to see some governments taking this seriously. When you're dealing with organizations with budgets of millions of dollars, I started talking about Doctors Without Borders because they're also involved in various scandals and attacks. $2.4 billion a year, of which about a third comes from the United States. A third. So IRS has an obligation there to do more than just stamp the forms they submit. They got to look at how that money is used, and they're going to see a lot of stuff there they shouldn't be doing. They're
Do you
political lobbying organizations under the guise of charities.
do you think the IRS is prepared to do that? I mean, maybe
Well,
under this administration, you might see some of that, especially because of the pushback on the U.S. aid cuts. But you know, there's an awful lot of bureaucratic inertia when it comes to dealing with this type of thing, and we've had 25 years of changing. Because this is natural in a democracy. We've had different administrations; they have different policies, different focuses, and clearly, I think during the Biden regency and the Obama administration, they saw the NGOs as allies, and they weren't about to take a close look at that. I'm a little surprised that we haven't seen a closer scrutiny of that during either of Trump's terms. I know that they're talking about it, and I know that in this term, they finally cut off the money to USAID, which is going to produce some of those results. But honestly, the problem with NGOs, non-government organizations, is that lack of accountability. And I don't know that the IRS is a sufficient organization to do anything about that, except in terms of just the filing of the paperwork. And this is where the SPLC screwed up. that they actually,
That's
at least
right.
allegedly, committed, money laundering and structuring. Structuring is a particular charge in under federal criminal statute, which means that you basically faked transfers and stuff like that to avoid having to report those types of transactions. And but most NGOs aren't going to make those mistakes because they
Well,
aren't playing in that type of field.
let's break that down a little bit because again, I'm going to be a little. Well, this is really. I'm going to be more optimistic than you. I'm never more optimistic about these things and have good
I
things
was
to
going to
say.
say I'm about to be stunned, Professor Steinberg.
But
Go ahead.
okay, so let's look at some of the details of what's going on. First of all, USAID was frozen in its tracks, and they appointed an inspector general. And that inspector general is issuing reports. And those reports are, like in the case of the SPLC, this is some of the organizations that were funded, big bucks, funded by USAID. And they're finding all sorts of things that should have been found 20 years ago. But the IRS is not equipped to do that. The inspector general, the office of the inspector general is, and especially when there's one appointed just for, and it's not just one individual, but just for USAID. When you have this huge multi-billion-dollar budget, IRS can't handle it. They don't have the personnel and they don't have the tools. And that's the second part of this.
Right.
And that is Congress. Congress, I'm a little disappointed, I guess, that they haven't followed through, but there's some very good, important precedents that have been set. Congressional committees and members of Congress, yeah, they're all on the Republican side, although some of the Democrats have expressed, I would say, I'm using the word cautiously, agreement or support with some of these initiatives, where they said to the IRS, we need you to look into more detail on this organization, again, NGOs, because they appear to be, I'm using my own language, the letters are couched in more legalistic terms, but basically that the letters are saying they appear to be violating the terms under which they get the tax exemption as a 501c3 organization through the US government. So we need you in the IRS to look at this in more detail. Now, the next level, it has to be legislation. One basic example is an NGO that gets a 501c3 status in the US does not have to report their funders. And particularly if they're getting money from Qatar or from a terrorist organization like the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, stuff that we've come up with and led to some designations by the administration, by the US government. That stuff is somewhat available and can be done. A lot more can be done, but they don't have the personnel to do that. They don't have the mandate to do that. But with AI now, you can take all these reports, like in the case of the SPLC, and you can compare it with other documents and show where there are discrepancies. Those will come out as red flags. And you say, hey, something here is wrong. Now we got to dig deeper. And that's something that we done, that as NGO monitors, something I instituted back many years ago without AI, but you pick certain cases and you see inconsistencies. Here's an example, Human Rights Watch, right? Ken Roth ran this great organization founded by a good guy, Bob Bernstein, to fight against closed regimes like the Soviet Union and bring them human rights. And you have this guy, Ken Roth, who turns in exactly the opposite direction. But back in 2009, I think a lot of history, they went out looking for money from Arab countries. They went to Saudi Arabia, said, you got to help us. They came back and they said, this is a woman by the name of Sarah Leah Whitston, went out there, and they came back and they said publicly, we didn't get any money. We went there to educate. Back about maybe 5-6 years ago, there was a leak from inside the organization about this Saudi billionaire, corrupt Saudi billionaire. And there are now pictures of him sitting with Ken Roth, Sarah Leah Whitston, and there's a picture of a check. He wrote a check for, I think, $500,000. There's probably a lot more out there. And she went to Libya, called the Gaddafi family human rights reformers in 2009.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But they don't have to release their funding details.
Right.
Whatever skeletons they have in the closet. And their board is very protective. Even when the leak came out, they didn't fire anybody for lying, for hiding money. And there was nothing illegal about it. There's no statute that says you can't get money from a Saudi billionaire, corrupt Saudi billionaire, from a dictator like Gaddafi.
Right.
That's got to change.
Well, at least the transparency on that has to change. They
Yeah,
should be
that's what.
disclosing their funding, especially if they're receiving two things, because I think this applies to the SPLC as well. And only just I just want to use it because it's
No,
a
it's a
example.
very important example in the U.S. context, and yesterday's news was very much pointed in that direction. You're right.
And I was happy to see it because, and this is the key part, even if they're not getting funding directly from the US government, the US government was partnering with the SPLC, very directly partnering with the SPLC on things like counter domestic terrorism strategy. And the SPLC was telling the FBI who the radicals were and who the radicals weren't.
Yep.
And if you're going to be in that type of a partnership position with the US government, your funding should be entirely transparent.
Absolutely.
And so should your books, right? All of your books, not just the income, but the outflow as well. And if that had been the case, they never would have been able to do what they did with these hate groups, which was to fund them, including apparently the Charleston rally. They funded that thing and then used it for fundraising for years afterwards. And that's true of other NGOs as well. Those that are partnering with the US government by either receiving funds or being part of its policy really should be fully transparent or should be fully cut loose from funding or partnership. And I think that at least that would be at least a good start for a lot of these NGOs. Not all of them. Some of them are completely private and people just believe what they say, but a lot of these things are effective because they have dug into government in one way or another, either funding or policy.
And again, I go back to the term of industry. You know, in real industry, in real business, you have checks and balances, right? If you're a company, you're a corporate entity, you got to, first of all, you got to, SEC, Security Exchange Commission, you got to set your books open. They got to be open. The stockholders, everybody else, got to get the information. If you cheat on that, you're going to pay a huge penalty. You might be shut down. There's a big framework for overseeing that. But NGOs with in some cases billion, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars, are not subject to any kind of checks and balances. They're not going to go bankrupt because they perform poorly, because they're corrupt, because they can hide it all. Amnesty International is another example. They get $400 million a year worldwide. The biggest chunk of that comes from the U.S. They don't get U.S. government funding, but they get European government funding. And it's all mushed together in this very obscure corporate governance system based in London. Nobody knows how it works, including people that I know who used to be members of Amnesty. They said they have no idea how their agenda is set and how their leaders are picked. And the lid is starting to come off of these things, but a lot more has got to be done. I don't see a Democratic administration, if and when they come to pass, that they're going to continue some of the reforms. So this has got to be done relatively quickly. It's going to be harder to reverse them when you have scandals and when you have new forms of accountability and transparency. So those have to be high priorities, something that different organizations are pushing in Congress and members of Congress are aware of. So it's got to be a combination. Inspector generals looking at the books, having members of Congress doing legislation to give the IRS more tools to do that accountability. Because right now, all their accountability is really to see that they're not putting money in Swiss bank accounts, that their accountants show that the money is being used as it is being declared. But it doesn't catch stuff like funding organizations like in Charleston, so they can create the business for the organization to be able to actually get more funding, get more donors, get more visibility. But that's that just captures the farce of the NGO world and the complete lack of checks and balances.
Without the evidence of that, I would have called that a reductio ad absurdum, a scenario,
there it is,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. They're generating their own business by faking race hoaxes. I mean, it's just, or funding them anyway. And
I got to tell you, it's about maybe 20 years ago, there was a Dutch journalist. Her name was Linda Polman. She wrote a book called The Aid Caravan. And I'm not doing it justice, but I give it to you in a quick summary. She covered all the wars and all the famines in Africa, Central Africa, in the Congo and elsewhere. And she described how NGOs would set up camp, bring large scale news video teams in, and this stuff 20 years ago, in order to be able to get more money from donors, particularly governments. And they would pay off the terrorists and all the thugs that ran these various children's armies in Africa and everything else. They're some of the worst of the worst of human behavior. And the NGOs that were supposed to be the ones who were being the enlightened, bringing good things, helping these poor people, were using it to raise money. Well, that's the same thing as the SPLC. That they were giving themselves the visibility and paying off the people and the organizations that were the source of some of the worst behavior in order to get more visibility, more publicity, and greater funding. So it's what were you calling it? It's not theater of absurd.
Reductio ad absurdum. The reductio ad absurdum of
it's the same language though.
Of scenarios, yeah.
The same idea, yeah. It's
I mean, really, it's a racket.
So to bring it back to Durban in 2001, 25 years ago, at that point they said we don't have anything to fear. We can come out and be this huge, powerful industry. They didn't call themselves industry, of course. Wonderful people.
Right.
Everybody's going to pay attention to what we're doing. And then for the last 25 years, they took that agenda and they kept repeating it and developing it and improving it so that when you get October 7th, 2023, and you have this terrible, unbelievable, indescribable, barbaric, inhuman attack, slaughter from Gaza against Israelis, civilians everywhere. And within 24 hours, you have this entire NGO world saying, well, they have to be protected from Israeli attacks, Israeli revenge, and we're going to erase the Israeli victims from this. That's what these NGOs did. But they practiced it every single year at every smaller incident that took place between Israel, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, from the end of the Durban conference to 2023. And that's where we are today, all orchestrated, led by the NGOs. I'll give you one other quick example of this. You may have seen, everybody saw in the New York Times, you don't have to read it to see this, that Nicholas Kristof, very well-known, highly respected opinion writer, didn't write an opinion piece. He wrote what was described as an investigation that Israel was using dogs to rape Palestinian prisoners. That was all orchestrated for Nicholas Kristof by an NGO called Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Network, which had a post office box, if that, in Geneva, an official Geneva address, and was considered to be, Kristof called it, an NGO that has been criticized for opposing Israeli policy or something like that. There was a completely bogus organization entirely within the Hamas framework. The people who ran it were well known in the sense that if you looked them up and saw what their connections were, they've been doing this 10 years before. They're the propagandists for Hamas. And Kristof, the New York Times, bought it hook, line, and sinker as not just legitimate, but NGOs getting out the facts. And since then,
this brings us back to the UN too, because Hamas has, co-opted UNRWA. I refer to it as UNRWA, but I mean, I don't know how anybody wants to pronounce that acronym, but UNRWA, which is had been the primary aid organization for the United Nations inside Gaza, and also elsewhere, but primarily Gaza, right? Hamas thoroughly infiltrated it. Hamas stored its weapons.
It over.
Yeah, they took it over, right?
Yeah, and teachers, all sorts of administrators, all sorts of people were found to be, or exposed to be, had Hamas military, what we call military official status. So they were collecting the salary from all the governments that put money into UNRWA, and they were building all these underground tunnels and controlling hospitals and the whole thing. to prepare for, and they ran a series of wars before. Like they had something like 20,000 rockets and missiles. All
Yeah.
but where that come from? They don't right. Where did it have to be paid for by aid because they had no other sources of funding? They took pipes, they showed how they were doing it. So yeah, UNRWA was a major source, and I got to emphasize this. They worked very closely with the NGOs. NGOs brought
Yeah.
in a lot of aid, and the same stuff was going on with that. Uh, and there's really no sense of self-inflect interest, looking internally to say, "Hey, we're part of this. How did this go wrong?" A few
Well,
donors said,
yeah.
"I don't want to do this anymore," but most of them are still doing it.
Well, it's because a lot of these donors with the NGOs that we're talking about are coming from regimes like Qatar, right?
Well, but
And
it's more
other
now. It's more than
places.
that. There are also people with a lot of money. They don't look at the details, but they want to have the pictures taken.
Yeah.
Pictures taken. They want to be seen, videos, all that stuff, and reels on Instagram as being among the great and the good. So Human Rights Watch runs these gala dinners. It's like the Met Gala. If you're anybody, if you're on the liberal side of politics and you want to be seen by all the right people, if you want a job in the White House, all those things, or a connection, you go to these galas and you fork over your money. And we look at the pictures and the coverage and the way they sell themselves. Yeah, you're going to be in the New York Times. You're going to have your picture taken because you were a big star at the gala. You were honored at the Human Rights Watch gala.
Yeah.
So you give your million or a few million over for that. It is a racket. It's a mafia process. But they've been very good at it. Ken Roth's major success when he ran Human Rights Watch for 30 years was raising money, getting the organization up to $100 million a year. And that's not government money mostly. That mostly comes from people who knew what they were doing or suckered into it. I did talk to a couple of donors who said to me they cut off their funding, and you could see that they did when they saw what was going on, but not nearly enough.
So that brings us to what to do now. The NGO Monitor has been, yeah, and again, this is ngo-monitor.org, which is where Professor Steinberg's organization that watches all these NGOs, and it's got a great website. There's lots of data there. There's lots of updates and current events that are taking place there. I highly encourage people to bookmark NGO Monitor. Uh, we've talked a little bit about some solutions, right? There's some legislative solutions that Congress can pass that will require more transparency and more scrutiny from the IRS on the basis of tax status for these organizations. But a lot of these organizations are going to operate outside of that anyway, because they're going to not partner with the government and maybe not take any official government money either. So what's the solution to deal with this? Because these guys have a 25-year head start, which is this reason why we're talking today. Is it's been 25 years since this Durban conference in 2001. They've got a 25-year head start, and we're seeing their success on college campuses and now in primaries in New York, Michigan, almost in Wisconsin, and other places inside the U.S.
There's a morphing process. It goes from the NGOs to political action committees and all sorts of other sources of funding for politicians. And I'm not going to claim to have answers on how you deal with all these issues, although transparency and accountability is a big part of it. When you're also dealing with all sorts of different types of brainwashing that goes on. So I'm going to stick to one part of that.
Okay.
And that is we talked about on the NGOs. It seems to me, when we talked about legislation and we talked about inspector generals, I'll just put it as a side comment that when, let's say, there's a Democratic Congress, maybe even a Democratic administration in 2 years, when they want to bring back the NGOs, they're going to have more trouble. Let's say refund USAID. There are going to be enough members of Congress, politicians, even Democrats who don't want to see and be accused of signing blank checks involving billions of dollars of taxpayer money. So some of this is going to stay. The more that stays, I think, the better, the more checks and balances there might be. This concept of an independent inspector general, giving the IRS the tools so they can do more than just minimal auditing. Clamping down on the abuse of the definition of what qualifies an organization to be a nonprofit charitable organization under the 501c3 framework, so that when they're doing politics 24/7, that's not what's supposed to be a charity supposed to be for. When they're doing lobbying, when they're out there doing hate and trashing and anti-Semitism, that should be clearly defined through the law as being unacceptable for a nonprofit or any organization. Certainly a nonprofit. It's not about free speech. It's about abusing the tax exempt status. And I think there should be a lot more. I thought, okay, I'm going to do this NGO stuff, NGO monitor stuff. You gave us a nice plug, and I should have put behind me put a placard with our address. But yeah, we monitor about 300 different organizations out of thousands, the ones that are the most virulent, the biggest ones. But you would think that there would be a similar type of framework within the academic world, within the research world, that would do the same thing we're doing. Not to wait for an attorney general or for Justice Department, for an inspector general, but hey, these organizations work in our cities and our states. There should be some framework to monitor what these groups are doing independently. So more awareness and more mechanisms. And I wouldn't wait for the government to do that. I think it's something that should be done through think tanks or other frameworks like that. American Enterprise Institute has some of this going on, needs to be expanded. Other think tanks, which are also in their own ways NGOs. So there's a broad spectrum of tools, but the most important thing is, hey, folks, don't be naive anymore. That's a hard thing to say, right? To tell people don't be naive. But I can't tell you, I give these talks all the time. I give them the talks also when I'm talking to people who are even college age, but mostly in their 40s, 50s, 70s, 80s. And they say to me, hey, I used to give, or I give to Amnesty every year. I got a certain amount of money I give every year. It's tax exempt. I give them to these wonderful organizations. But you just told me, they'll often say to me, breaks my heart. I've been giving so much money to these groups, and they're doing so much against what I believe is important. But most recently, I've done it with Doctors Without Borders, where there are so many medical people who are part of that. And they say, hey, when I first started out back in the 70s or 80s, they were doing good things. I didn't pay attention. Then now you're showing me how bad they've gone, how much they're doing hate propaganda that's got nothing to do with helping people in medical need. And I just wasn't paying attention. So you take responsibility where your money goes. It's hard to do. But I think the tools are available to go online and ask, okay, what are the criticisms of these organizations? What scandals they've been involved in?
Well, and I think that, again, NGO Monitor is going to be a big part of that, ngo-monitor.org. But it's incumbent on everybody to actually do the research, right? We live in an era where this information is available and it's easily accessible. There's really no barrier to research in the way that there may have even been 25 years ago when this thing first started in Durban, right? I mean, not everybody had broadband internet. Hardly anybody probably had the type of broadband internet that we're talking about now. Most people, a lot of people probably still on dial-up. It was difficult. It was not easy to do this type of thing. You got all sorts of tools now. There's really no excuse for not knowing the nature of these NGOs. And I think maybe, and this is me being optimistic, the whole thing with the SPLC might show that they've gotten so arrogant that basically they've left their butts exposed to this. And this, maybe we're going to be in a sort of a breaking cycle where a lot of this stuff actually starts coming out and it really forces them to either change their ways or their funding to dry up. Maybe I'm being a little too optimistic about that, but I'm certainly hopeful that that might be the case.
I think another key element of that is journalists.
Yes.
Whatever that may mean today.
Not Nicholas Kristof. No more rape dogs.
Yeah, and probably not the New York Times, but the Free Press.
Probably not.
And Free Beacon and all those other places there. This is out there. So a journalist is less likely, at least from those places, to say, hey, this is a good NGO. Whatever they say, got to be right. I'm just going to give them a headline and I'm going to cut and paste from their press releases. I can't tell you how many times I've counted in the New York Times, Washington Post, the whole spectrum, where they'll write an article about a report written. I do it on Israel because that's where I live. But where they'll take a report, Israel's committing genocide, Israel's committing apartheid, and they'll put it into a 500-word, 1,000-word article straight out of the press release. And they may have one line of denial of criticism just to be able to say, hey, we asked about it. But they didn't read the report. And everybody knows they didn't read 250-page report, because if they did, they'd see that it's just circular argument. They're all quoting each other. There's no substance to it. There's no real research to it. So
it's the difference between journalism and stenography. And unfortunately, we get a lot of stenography and not a lot of journalism these days, even
it's
with all the competition.
ideological stenography.
It is.
These are good guys. They're part of the world that I like. I'm going to give them the publicity, probably without even thinking it through. It's just automatic pilot. So that's another element there that needs to be thought through and I think changed. And the SPLC may be a trigger for that.
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope it is a trigger that exposes the entire NGO industry, at least for the malign actors within that industry, and really kicks off scrutiny. But again, NGO Monitor is a huge part of that, and your work, Professor Gerald Steinberg, as well. I know we probably got to wrap up here, but I want to thank you for taking this much time to walk through this. Coming up to the 25th anniversary of this ill-advised conference. Travesty, yeah, that's the right word.
And I appreciate it very much. Thanks for the time and for always good, focused questions. Pleasure.
Thank you, sir.